Just so we talked about what do you know about the government budget, and that was in the, we talked about the first steps in trade, and that's what the bell ringer's about that you answered in the chat. Hopefully, we're able to complete the budget activity, clicking on the website and going through and trying to fix the debt, making the debt as a percentage of the GDP as low as possible, going through making the selections. And once again, if you need to know more about any of those, you can just click on Learn More, and it will tell you about each of these. And then just follow the directions that are highlighted there, copy and paste the numbers you have for various spending and taxing categories, click Submit, and paste the information, and then answer each of those questions to finish up. But today we'll look at the remaining part of the global economy. And so first we'll talk about banking and loans. And this has to do with development and trade, not literally just the banking that occurs within countries. And so there's a couple organizations that are in the news quite a bit that do help out with developing countries in particular. And the first one is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. International Monetary Fund. And it monitors exchange rates and policies of countries. It helps isolate inflation and provides advice about how to fix economies. And the IMF is always led by a European. So a European is always in charge of the IMF. The other organization is the World Bank. It provides monetary assistance to developing countries. And so it provides loans to nations, especially for things like infrastructure and trade. Its president is always an American. And it tries to provide goals for countries to meet. Mostly because they'd like their money paid back. Now, of course, there are people that are suspicious of these two groups because obviously they're led by people from wealthy countries. The goals that they set are just based on data. Some accuse them of not taking into consideration human needs. And so sometimes when these groups, especially they have large conferences, you might see protesters gathering around them just because there's a general suspicion of them. And of course, they try to emphasize trade as much as possible. We talked yesterday about how that focuses on the comparative advantage, making sure that countries are making goods and services while putting forth the least amount of resources into them. So that way there's as little waste as possible. Not all countries want to do that, though. Some countries want to engage in protectionist types of policies. But just briefly, I'll mention two places. One would be Africa, the African continent. They often receive a lot of assistance. There's over 50 countries there. Not all of them are in the exact same position. The problem was, of course, when the European countries colonized Africa. They took a lot of natural resources, but did not build a lot of infrastructure. So that's one of the major problems with trade in Africa is there's limited ways to have these countries basically sell goods and services due to a lack of highways, landline phones, for instance. That system never really picked up there extensively. Basic systems for processing clean water and removing sewage. So a lot of these types of infrastructure basics that we take for granted didn't necessarily get started or are in poor situations in Africa. And so those two organizations, when they do invest in countries there, they try to emphasize those types of projects. And some countries like China have been heavily investing in Africa. China, of course, has over 1 billion people, and they would like the agricultural resources and minerals of Africa, so they have been buying up property and investing in African countries. That's, of course, a concern for the United States, as they are our biggest competitor. And so things like oil, especially in the north, rare minerals in Central Africa, especially things that we need for items like cell phones and laptops, can be found there. And then, of course, there is light manufacturing in Southern Africa as well. And speaking of China, China has become more and more involved in trade and is involved in some of those organizations that I just mentioned. It didn't always used to be that way. Before their growth, around 1980 or so, before that, Mao, the dictator of China, did not have a lot of good economic ideas. He tried to force the country to industrialize in what was called the Great Leap Forward, but it was a disaster due to his misunderstanding of what industrialization meant. He thought that just meant China needed to make a lot of steel. And so he reallocated people from farms and other businesses just making steel, even though they had no knowledge of it. And so it actually resulted in the production of a lot of terrible metals that didn't actually take or couldn't be used for anything. And it also meant there weren't a lot of people engaged in the other industries. So there was a famine that happened because they took so many people away from farms to work in steel. So after Mao died, of course, the country moved toward more open trade, including allowing foreign investment, and their own businesses are privately owned and can do business throughout the rest of the world. Uh, China has even just recently they're cracking down on antitrust violations. So there are companies engaged in monopoly practices, and they're trying to stop that because they want to encourage more competition, which is surprising. So they have been moving more toward a free market economy, although compared to us, they're still much more toward the command end of the spectrum. But it has led to rapid growth in their gross domestic product, their GDP, for instance, and rapid modernization. In fact, if you go to some of their cities, especially along the coast, you'll see that they're incredibly westernized. If you just look at them from the outside without looking too close to the culture, you'd think it's just another European or an American city. But of course, the rural areas have lagged behind, and with their growth, they've had some of the same problems that we saw in the 1890s or 19 teens: pollution, lots of mobility, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, except there's lots of homelessness and transients moving back and forth. So there's still huge sections of poverty that exist, and a big gap that's growing more and more between the wealthiest people, who are usually associated with the Communist Party, ironically, and then the poor. Now, a lot of Americans, of course, look unfavorably on China, thinking that they have an unfair trade advantage, but that's because we don't have a trade agreement with China. So we do have tariffs and other regulations, But China is just so much cheaper at producing things that even with all those barriers, it is still less expensive to buy Chinese goods from them than it is American goods being purchased over there. And then the last one I'll mention is India. India has also shown a lot of growth, although they have industrialized more organically. It hasn't been forced through by the government in any way. They do have some English compatibility since they're a former British colony, which gives them an advantage. And they do have a significant portion of their population engaged in technology. Now, that isn't to say you could go to any random place in India and you'll find people working on their computers. There's still, like in China, the rural areas are less developed, still massive amounts of poverty. You have cities where there's big skyscrapers right next to acres and acres of slums. And so obviously there's some discrepancy between the rich and the poor there as well. And you still have hundreds of millions of people that are in poverty. But of course, if you had to pick one, India or China, which you would like to see do better, obviously India is a democracy that does have the same basic freedoms that we do here in the United States. So India and China are two countries to watch going forward, especially as China is nipping at our heels when it comes to productivity and wealth. And then, of course, India as well, because they have over 1 billion people. They'll soon surpass the population of China. And then Africa is a place to watch because of all of those resources and fertile land, especially south of the Sahara, going into the future. So those are all the notes for the unit. So for the remainder of today and tomorrow, of course, take the time to make sure that you completed everything in unit number 8, including the reading that was at the beginning of the week. And then in your notifications, I sent you anything that was missing from unit number 7. So please make sure you completed all that. And next week is a review and test week. The test will be Thursday.
What about tomorrow?
Tomorrow, like I said, for the remainder of today and tomorrow, you can work on the assignments from unit number 8, including the reading at the beginning of the week. And then don't forget to check on notifications from unit number 7. Does anybody have any questions? None? Okay, so finish up that budget activity if you haven't already, please. And get that turned in before the end of the period.